Let's cut to the chase, have an honest conversation, and develop real answers. As a matter of fact, with Andrew Cuomo. Hello, and welcome back to As a Matter of Fact. I'm Andrew Cuomo. Joining us today is national security and foreign policy expert, Mr. Gordon Chang. He's the author of The Coming Collapse of China. He is a senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute. I believe he's one of the premier national experts in this area. He's worth following on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang, and we're pleased and proud to have him with us today. Well, Gordon, it's good to be with you once again. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Governor.
So, Gordon, this past weekend, I was at a graduation. One of my daughters was graduating business school, and it was a big graduation weekend all across the board. And I was talking to the graduates, and we have so many immediate problems for them, right? We were talking about the concept of leave the place a better place than you found it. And top of mind, look how many issues this next generation will face. We have environmental issues, we have global warming, we have division that we've never had before, economic anxiety, crime, mental health, homelessness, a list of really difficult problems. And then the thought of potential nuclear war, World War III. Let's not call it nuclear war, World War III. You know, Gordon, I haven't thought about that possibility in 20 years of public service. I don't think I've ever been talking about possibility of world war. But it's more and more a real possibility. You know, you have these isolated situations, and I think we tend to think of them as isolated situations. Well, we have Russia, Ukraine. We all see that. We understand that. We have China, Taiwan. We all see that. We understand that. Northern Africa situation, Middle East situation, Israel. We understand that. You also have a China-India problem. You have a Greece-Turkey problem. But we tend to talk about them as isolated individual situations. In other words, that there wouldn't be a negative synergy among these things, that they couldn't spontaneously combust, or combustion of one cause combustion of others. But I don't know that that's true. You could have a series of individual conflicts that increase, and where one triggers an international situation, or where one triggers other specifics to ignite. And I don't know if I was talking myself into it, or but I think it's more of a possibility than we have been discussing writ large, maybe because we're so consumed with the domestic. You know, Americans can tend to be parochial, right? We're worried about America, and we're worried about Donald Trump, and we're worried about Joe Biden, and we're worried about the urban crisis and the migrants. But on the bigger scale, what are we looking at? And besides the specific individuals, what is the probability that we could see an international situation?
I think we're a lot closer than we have been in a very long time, Governor. Of course, there's the war in Ukraine. At the same time, China and Russia are destabilizing North Africa. And I'm very glad that you mentioned that, because most people forget it. But we have the Wagner Group, the Russian mercenaries, almost certainly paid for by China. They are taking Sudan and they are turning that country upside down. There's also problems in southern Libya. And so North Africa is a tinderbox. Also, sort of the sub-Saharan Africa now is a place for terrorism and for destabilization. This is part of the problem right now, and that is you have one crisis occurring at the time of others. Now, normally, these crises don't merge, but we are starting to see common threads. We're seeing China, for instance, with regard to Iran, with regard to Ukraine, North Africa. And we really have to be concerned about what happens in East Asia, because if there is conflict in East Asia at the same time Ukraine's occurring, then that pretty much looks like war at both ends of the Eurasian landmass, and that looks like global conflict.
What does war look like now, right? World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. We've all seen the movies, and we have a picture in our mind of what war looks like. What would the next war look like, Gordon?
If it is indeed in East Asia, or whether there is a dangerous intercept in the global commons that goes horribly wrong, then this is pretty much all-out war, because China right now is militarized. The Chinese military has become so much more influential in the political system, which means that Beijing cannot act constructively with others if there were some incident. So right now, we have got to be extremely concerned. One other thing is that Xi Jinping is pushing the country toward war. He can't stop talking about it. He's mobilized China's civilians for war. And the most disturbing thing of all that we have seen in recent weeks are this news of purges inside the Chinese military of officers who are opposed to an invasion of Taiwan. One of them got a death sentence in February. Now, I think that death sentence will be commuted to life imprisonment. But the point is that Xi Jinping is making sure that the Chinese military will go if he orders it to do so.
Gordon, we understand what happens when Russia invades Ukraine. When China let's say China invades Taiwan, what does that look like? Is that analogous to what we're seeing in the Ukraine?
I think it's going to be a little bit different because the Chinese doctrines are different. So, for instance, we might not know of China starting a war for months because they could, for instance, release a pathogen. We know that the Chinese military is working on what they call specific ethnic genetic attacks, which are pathogens that hit only certain ethnic groups. So China could be spreading those pathogens, and we wouldn't know it for quite some time.
As a technical aside, for those of you who are watching this on video, we've lost the video connection with Gordon, but luckily we still have the audio connection. Gordon, the sense I get watching Ukraine, why would China, let's say China started war with Taiwan, why would they directly give the United States a rationale for getting involved by attacking a U.S. base? Why wouldn't they look back at history and say, look, World War II, America was very isolationist, right? We were watching everything that was going on around us. People were imploring FDR to get involved. We knew the concentration camps were operational. But until Pearl Harbor, public sentiment didn't shift. Why wouldn't China say this is between China and Taiwan and start with that as a first step rather than directly engaging America?
That's a great question, Governor. But I think that the Chinese believe that the United States will be involved in a war in any way, and their idea is to intimidate Washington to make sure that the United States does not get engaged. This is something like the Japanese thought at Pearl Harbor, that if they were able to destroy the Pacific Fleet, that the United States would not pursue the war. I think the Chinese are misperceiving, but their logic is this. First of all, that for them to have a successful invasion of Taiwan, they have to establish a blockade for that blockade to be successful, it has to be big enough to include sovereign Japanese territory, specifically the island of Yonaguni. Although most of Japan is north of Taiwan, Yonaguni is actually south of Taipei. It's within 58 nautical miles of Taiwan's east shore. And we have a mutual defense treaty with Japan. So I think the Chinese believe that Japan would get involved in an invasion of Taiwan and therefore the United States. Their logic from a military point of view is impeccable. So I think that they believe that since they're going to be fighting the U.S. anyway, they might as well get in the first blow.
Okay, let me ask you this then. I understand that thinking. By that analogy, is the United States involved in Ukraine?
Yes, and the reason is, although the battle is fought between Ukrainian and Russian forces, I think China views Ukraine as a proxy war, and that the two main contestants are not Kyiv and Moscow, but Beijing and Washington. So they are looking at this for clues about how the United States is going to deal with additional crises. So Taiwan's future, I believe, will be largely determined in the fields of Ukraine. And the Chinese see it that way. Unfortunately, we do not, which means that we can come up with some pretty unfavorable outcomes, and the war in Ukraine can spread to East Asia.
But let's just stay on there for 1 second. It's a bit of an aside, Gordon, but it's Ukraine is a proxy war. But the United States is not really fully engaged, right? This is not a full-throated U.S. Activity. It's we're participating economically. If you believe some reports, we are providing supervisory personnel, but it's not a full-throated activity. Is this what would happen with Taiwan, do you think, or would it be more a more obvious, more direct confrontation?
I think it would be a more direct confrontation. And the reason is, although many people in the U.S. Don't want to be involved in a war in Taiwan, and many think that we wouldn't, we got to go back to history to see some similar situations. So, for instance, in 1950, Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State at the time, drew America's Western Defense Perimeter in public, and it did not include South Korea. Kim Il-sung, the North Korean dictator, almost immediately invaded the South after that. And the reason is that Kim had long sought approval from both Stalin and from Mao to get the green light to invade the South. And both the Russian and the Chinese dictators said no, because you're going to have to fight the Americans. When Dean Acheson drew that defense perimeter to not include the South, then Kim got the green light. Truman immediately went to South Korea's aid. And this occurred also in 1990 during the administration of George H.W. Bush. Saddam Hussein actually sat down with April Glaspie, our ambassador to Iraq. And the Iraqi dictator just asked, what would the United States do if there was a war over Kuwait? And Glaspie's response, which was at the direction of James Baker, Secretary of State at the time, was this, almost a quote, we Americans have no interest in the resolution of intra-Arab disputes. Well, Saddam Hussein took that as an indication the U.S. would not defend Kuwait. 8 days later, he invades Kuwait, and what do? We then go to Kuwait's aid and become fully involved in that war. So if history is any guide, Governor, then although we may say before that we will not defend Taiwan, chances are that we will.
As a Cold War baby, as someone who was raised during the Cold War, when I went to school, Gordon, they had air raid drills, and In elementary school, you'd be trained to get under the desk and you'd go down into the basement of the school. And it was really a frightening, talk about traumatizing young people. But then we sort of got to a place of, well, nobody would use nuclear weapons because that's mutually assured destruction. You'd have to be out of your mind because if you push a button, then the other side pushes a button and then the game is over and everybody loses. Is there a way that nuclear could be deployed that would not be a total sum game? Or is there a person who's just that irrational who's now leading a country that could do that in reality?
Vladimir Putin, both before and after his invasion of Ukraine, threatened the use of nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe. And I believe that he thinks he can keep a nuclear conflict contained. In other words, he could use his tactical nukes, battlefield weapons, and the United States would not respond with a strategic response. In other words, using our intercontinental ballistic missiles against Russia. And I think the Chinese believe the same thing. Although most military analysts believe that China doesn't have tactical nukes, there are some people who do assess that China has them. In other words, small nuclear weapons on cruise missiles. So I think both the Chinese and the Russians think that they can keep a nuclear conflict contained at a lower level. Whether they can or not, that, of course, only history can determine that. But there is a rational argument that they would be able to do so.
On the same theory, the pathogen strategy that you mentioned, which after what we've gone through with COVID has a greater relevance, right? But isn't that almost akin to the nuclear theory that you release a pathogen in Taiwan or wherever, but that pathogen will inevitably spread internationally, and then you'll lose control?
Yes, well, with COVID, there is more and more reporting and circumstantial evidence to show that SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen that causes this disease, was actually engineered. But whether it was engineered or not, China was not at the point of being able to contain it. They are working on what they call specific ethnic genetic attacks, as I mentioned. And these are pathogens that will leave the Chinese immune but sicken and kill everybody else. And this is possible. So I think that they are, believing that they could use a disease either at the beginning of a war or maybe even towards its intermediate or later stages. And part of it is if they're a party to the Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits them from having biological weapons, and so are we. And I don't think we really have them, but China does. And so China believes that it probably could use them and that we would have no effective biological weapons response. And they would be correct in that. Now, we would have other responses, which might be more effective. But the point is they do have an edge on the use of disease.
But Gordon, can they believe, after what we just went through with COVID, this is a level of sophistication where you can develop a pathogen that only affects American people, COVID was a nightmare for everyone, right? China had more of a problem with COVID than anyone else. Can they be realistic or bound to reality in the concept that they can develop a specific pathogen that will only infect a certain type of person?
Jason, I think his name is Jason Crow, who congressman from Colorado, at the Aspen Security Forum last year actually talked about the ability to develop a pathogen that affects only one individual. So biological research has progressed at a very fast pace. So I think that China is realistic in thinking that they can develop these pathogens that will hit only the non-Chinese. Now, how a pathogen evolves after it's released, they may not be able to control that. And certainly with COVID, it affected everybody. But COVID probably was not one of these specific ethnic genetic attacks. It was something that got out into the general Chinese population before they could perfect it. But that doesn't mean, even though COVID hit everybody and the Chinese the hardest, it doesn't mean that they're not working on this type of research. China has proven capability in this regard, and we have seen the effects of COVID, and they have seen how COVID did cripple societies. So this was proof of concept, Governor.
Well, that's a frightening concept, because if they look at it as proof of concept, even if they do that retrospectively, it was crippling. And by the way, we're in no better position, plus or minus, today to deal with a COVID situation than we were 2 or 3 years ago. That's one of the points that I harp on. You went through COVID, at least learn from it. This nation does not have an emergency medical response capacity that can handle something like COVID. We've never prepared for it. We geared up, actually, over the past 20 years or so to deal with natural disasters, right? Hurricanes, increased floods, etc. And we developed a capacity that we never had before to deal with natural disasters. We're much better at it. Not great, but much better at it. But we have no emergency medical response to speak of, right? That whole alphabet soup of federal agencies and international agencies, WHO, CDC, HHS, they were not competent in dealing with COVID. We didn't have the personnel. We didn't have the resources. We didn't even have masks. We didn't even know what our testing capacity was, our lab capacity. We couldn't produce enough vaccines. So if they are looking at that, they can see a real vulnerability, I think, in the United States' ability to defend itself.
Oh, absolutely. The last great pandemic was the Spanish flu after the first, or towards the end of the First World War. And so that was 100 years ago. And so, we were not prepared. We didn't even think about these things, and we made it up as we went along. And I can understand, with the vaccine, which I think was oversold by both the Trump and Biden administrations, there's now this ideological view on vaccination. And we can see, for instance, if China is able to spread an extremely deadly pathogen which targets only us, then this vaccine hesitancy will prevent us from having an effective response. Because what China is developing is a civilization killer. And when you have an existential threat, COVID was not existential, but if we do have a disease which poses an existential threat, we will need people to be vaccinated. And so right now, we are less prepared on this. This is just one of the realities where we have become, it's become ideological, and that doesn't serve us well.
Yeah. Well, you can say the P word, Gordon. It's become political. But it's actually sad, frankly, that post-COVID, not only did we fail to learn the lesson of developing the processes and the operations, but I think it was a setback for the credibility of government in such a situation. And if government now stood up and said, well, we understand that there's been a new pathogen released and everybody must take this vaccine, I think the credibility, the compliance would be much lower than it was at any other time, just because of what we went through in COVID, and it did become political. And if not political or ideological, the competence was questioned right? Does government really know what it's talking about when it stands up its chief medical officer who says, take this vaccine, it will keep you safe, and don't worry, it won't have any negative side effects? I think that credibility has been badly damaged. And if you're China or one of the countries looking to attack this nation, the best attack, I think, is from within. How do you use the division of the American people as the weapon of war? The division, the lack of credibility towards our government. How do you use that as the weapon? I used to worry as governor that they would deploy the weapon of panic. I've been in a number of natural disasters. I was in the federal government before, as you know, as the HUD secretary, so I would be one of the first on the ground for a hurricane, a flood, or whatever. Panic, and what panic does to break down social order is something that I had never seen before actually manifest itself. And when you panic people, they will hurt each other. They will do what they have to do. If you can panic, if you had a false report that said, I'm in New York City, if you had a false report that said, there has been a chemical released in the air in New York City, and you cannot breathe the air, it will kill you. Gordon, you would have 8 million people in a very dense environment, stepping over each other to try to flee New York, and literally creating pandemonium and killing people in the process. So panic, if you could figure out a strategy to unleash panic, I think the current day analogy is find a way to use the division of the American people against the country itself. Does that make any sense to you?
I couldn't agree more, because we know that Russia and China have tried to and been successful in dividing the American people. China puts a lot of effort into political warfare. And part of their political warfare is to create the divisions among Americans and to foment violence on American streets, which is what they did in 2020, for instance. So everything you say is absolutely right. And as you were talking, I was trying to think of 8 million people trying to flood through the Holland and Lincoln tunnels, over the George Washington Bridge, over the RFK Bridge to get out of the city. I mean, it would be a total breakdown of society. And one of the things that when we think about modern society, in many ways it is resilient, but in other ways, once it fails more completely than a primitive society. So everything you said is 100% correct. I worry about things like that.
Oh, Gordon, I don't want to tell you what you should worry about, because I'm sure you have, with your level of knowledge, you have plenty to worry about. But I worry about the fragility of society. You can step back and say, oh, we're sophisticated. We have all these devices and all these sophisticated government agencies that know what they're doing. Baloney. You have one domino fall, and you can see mayhem throughout society. We saw it at parts during COVID. We were right on the brink there. When you think about COVID, if the New York Police Department said, you know what, our members are not going to show up, you can't tell us that we are safe, and you're not paying us any more money to put our lives at risk, so the NYPD is not showing up. Or the nurses say, we're not showing up, we're afraid. Or the doctors say we're not showing up. Or the bus drivers say we're not showing up. Or the National Guard says, we didn't sign on for this. I mean, any one of those triggers, Gordon, and now you have real pandemonium because the NYPD doesn't show up, the police department doesn't show up, well, then the fire department isn't going to show up, and then the transit workers aren't going to show up, then the utility workers aren't going to show up, and then you're in the dark, and then the Teamsters Union says, well, I'm not driving trucks, and now there's no food on the shelves. I mean, this could happen like this. And people talk about what I went through during COVID. Yes, it was a medical issue, but it was more than anything keeping society stable. Because again, for me, it went back to that panic. I remember seeing people trying to get home to their families in a hurricane. They would drive right past the police. They would threaten to run over the police. They would drive over yards. They would have car accidents and keep going. And that fragility, I don't think people fully appreciate. And when you say to people, there are no police, there's no food on the shelves, the lights have gone out because the utility workers stayed home to be safe. We've never been there before. We have never been there before. And that, to me, is frightening. And if we had an enemy who could trigger that, you wouldn't need the nuclear sophistication. You wouldn't need any of this. Just trigger that panic or ignite the division of the American people, and this country will do damage unto itself.
Yes, and while we're talking about China, the war correspondent Michael Yon is at the Darien Gap, and that's the area between Colombia and Panama, which is about 70 miles of really intense forest and jungle. And it's the area where migrants who are coming into the United States through our southern border, they must traverse that. Michael is seeing, there's a surge of Chinese migrants into the U.S., unprecedented. And 99.99% of those people are who they say. They're desperate to get out of China because of the distress in Chinese society, and they're seeking a better life. But Michael is starting to see large groups of males of military age traveling together, pretending not to speak English. And Michael believes that they are either Chinese military, People's Liberation Army, or Ministry of State Security. And these are basically saboteurs coming into our country. On the first day of a war in Asia, these individuals could be attacking our grid. They could be poisoning our water, assassinating officials, creating the panic that you talked about. And so we've got to be really concerned about what's going on. And this is one of those things where you talk about the fragility of society. You're absolutely right about that.
And look, you wouldn't even have to do it effectively. You would have to just do it to the point where people had the fear, right? Your water supply is poisoned. Most municipalities have a reservoir system piped in. The piping system has been infiltrated, and there is they have injected a substance that can cause death. Don't drink the water. Okay, that's panic in and of itself. Remember during COVID, Gordon, what people did in grocery stores, hoarding essential material and even non-essential material, right? I still never understood, of all the things, why you would hoard toilet paper. You know what I mean? But it's that fragility, I think, is the vulnerability going forward. And I'm sure they have targeted that because the fragility plays into the political division, social division that we already have. the appeal to the collective goodwill, help your neighbor, trust your neighbor, that is at low ebb right now in this country. And if you can combine that with a sense of panic and disorder, I think it would be frightening. Let me ask you this. The Israel situation, the lack of support for Israel, the drop in support for Israel, especially among Democrats, by the way, over the past 20 years has been staggering to me. I think the Palestinians have done a very good job of making their case, and you now have Amnesty International saying Israel is a government that violates human rights. And the United States Congress, the support is waning. The anti-Semitism in this world and in this country is at an all-time high. Do you see any problem, besides the obvious, any potential escalation in the Middle East with Israel?
There will be, largely because Iran is very close to developing a nuclear weapon. It has ballistic missiles. North Korea and China have supplied it with technology and with plans. And I fear what the Iranians will do once they have the bomb. Israel is endangered, and the Abraham Accords were a good start, and I hope that the Biden administration will continue to implement them. But we're a long way from peace in the Middle East right now. And just to underline something you said, open anti-Semitism in the West is, to me, it was inconceivable, but it is occurring. We have forgotten the Holocaust. We have forgotten the crimes against humanity and the genocide. And this is, growing up in the 1950s, and the 60s, I just thought it was impossible that anti-Semitism would become the flavor of the day. But it certainly has. And this is one of those trends that you talk about when you talk about the fragility of society. This is completely unacceptable, but it's occurring very fast.
It is. Tell us how that plays out. We've all heard that, Gordon. Iran has nuclear weapons, and now Israel has a problem. How does that actually play out?
Well, I hope that it plays out like India and Pakistan, which both have nuclear weapons. Neither is a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and there hasn't been peace between the two countries, but it hasn't escalated. And so maybe that is the model for the Middle East, especially if we can reinforce the Abraham Accords, that Iran will attack Israel, but they won't start a major conflict. And that is perhaps the way going forward, if you're an optimist, which to a certain extent I am, because I think nuclear weapons does change the calculus. The problem, of course, is that you get a leader who believes that through threats to use the world's most destructive arsenal, they can attain advantage without actually having to light them off, and that gets beyond control. So we always have to be on guard there. But I do hope that the stability that nuclear weapons generally brings to relationships will play out in the Middle East as it has played out during the Cold War, and as I mentioned, with India and Pakistan.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. One of the underlying common denominator issues here, lack of trust in the U.S. government, lack of trust in the U.S. leadership. And it seems to me like there are some really simple situations that develop that fuel that lack of credibility. Chinese spy balloon a couple of weeks ago. China sent a spy balloon, but the spy balloon was visible from someone's backyard. So you look up and you see a balloon, and the balloon is floating across your neighborhood. And the U.S. government says, yes, that is a Chinese spy balloon. And we're going to allow it to float across the entire United States because we're afraid to shoot it down, because if we shoot it down, it may hurt someone when it lands. But then there's a second spy balloon, and we actually do shoot that one down. This story sounds incredible. It sounds incredible. Why would China send a spy balloon that is visible from someone's yard? Either they are incompetent when it comes to spy balloons, or they wanted you to see it, which is takes you down a different track, or it was something else. And I think Americans hear a story like this, and it doesn't sound true. And if it's true, it makes me really question the capacity and competence of the American government.
Yeah, on that last point, because there are many important points you just raised, but on the last point, it has been reported, and I actually believe it to be true, that, well, we know the balloon entered territorial U.S. airspace on January 28th. It was reported, and I believe it to be true, that the Pentagon did not notify President Biden until the fourth day of the incursion. During those 4 days, the balloon traversed Alaska and western part of Canada, where it could have been taken down without any threat to life or property. And so that's the competence of the Pentagon. Once that balloon entered the lower 48 states, as you point out, the administration said it did not want to take it down for the reason you mentioned. But we got to remember that that balloon collected incredibly important information, which China could not have gotten through any other means. And for the administration to downplay China's benefits from that balloon, I think we're wrong. What they were able to do was, first of all, to collect signals intelligence on nuclear weapons sites. That balloon maneuvered over Maelstrom, F.E. Warren, and the Minot Air Force bases, where we have all of our land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Minuteman IIIs. It then flew by Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, where we have all of our B-2 strategic bombers, and Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, the home of U.S. Strategic Command, which controls all U.S. nuclear weapons. They picked up a lot of signals intelligence, and also they saw our attempts to disrupt their signals, which was extremely valuable. And the administration should not have downplayed that. But at this point, I think that it showed an American government that did not understand the nature of China, because the most important aspect of the balloon incident is it showed China's utter disrespect for the United States. This was a gross and obvious violation of our sovereignty. They thought they could get away with it, and it showed that deterrence has failed. And that is critical, because when deterrence fails, nothing ever good happens. And the most dangerous periods in history are when governments try to reestablish deterrence. And that's exactly where we are at this moment.
Gordon, another incident like that, and you've been very generous with your time. We now read that China is setting up a base in Cuba, 100 miles from Florida. But we also read that this is not new, that the base was there since 2017, or the base was there since 2019. And really, this is going to be an upgrade of a base. But if the base was there in 2017 or 2019, why didn't we know about it? And why wasn't it a major problem then, right? We go back to the John Kennedy administration with Cuba. And why do we have these different stories? And why is it so hard for the American government to explain in a clear, cohesive manner to the American people what is actually going on? Because credibility matters. It matters. When I said to the people of not just New York, this country. COVID is dangerous. We're going to close schools, close businesses, and wear a mask. They believed me, and that saved lives. Credibility matters. Where is the credibility of the U.S. government? And how do they expect people to believe three different scenarios, none of which make sense, which range from you were entirely deceptive by not telling us about the base in 2019, to you were incompetent to allow it to exist and not do anything about it. And then it's just a big question mark, and FDR, fireside chats, that was all about this. That was, I want you to see my face. I want you to look in my eyes. I want you to know that I am communicating sincerely to you. We're at the other end of the spectrum from that. Who believes what anymore? Newspapers have political biases. But even more, you don't see the Biden administration saying, let me explain the Cuba situation and let me erase the doubt from your mind so at least you have trust in the government.
Yes. The Wall Street Journal story that reported that China was establishing a signals intelligence facility in Cuba came out, I think it was Thursday. Thursday and Friday, John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, gave that denial, saying that the report was not accurate. That denial may have been truthful, but it was, as you point out, extremely deceptive, because the truth is that China had a facility. And then we see this report a couple days ago that an administration official talking anonymously reports that there was a Chinese existing facility in Cuba since 2019. The truth is that China has had signals intelligence facilities, probably more than one, in Cuba for most, if not all, of this century. There is one at Lourdes, which was perhaps the biggest Soviet listening post outside of the Soviet Union. It was well known that Chinese technicians took over a portion of Lourdes. There's also reports that there were two other Chinese listening facilities in Cuba, one at Bayucol and the other at Santiago de Cuba. For the administration to give a technical denial last Thursday and Friday, when they had to know that people would figure this out, just shows a basic lack of competence on the part of the Biden administration. Because it was known by people that Chinese technicians, Chinese equipment was already on the island. So why deny it in that manner? I don't know the answer to this, Governor, why John Kirby or the people who direct what Kirby says would think that they could get away with it. But clearly they didn't. It was foreseeable or virtually inevitable that they wouldn't get away with it, because the information about China's presence in Cuba has been well known for a very long time.
Gordon, first of all, thank you so much for your time. It's such a pleasure to listen to you, because it's such a pleasure to hear facts, frankly. We have so few facts and objective voices in our discussion. But I want to leave our listeners and even you with this thought. The vulnerability to me, yes, we have missiles and we have the best armed forces on the globe. The real vulnerability is triggering the internal dissension that now exists in this country. The lack of trust of the U.S. government, the lack of unity among people, the distrust of the information they are receiving from the government, the skepticism about the competence of the government. Even if you believe that they believe what they're saying, do they actually understand and know what they're saying? And COVID, spy balloons, Cuba, Middle East and that dialogue about Israel and Palestine, they're all triggering the same point. The American people, lack of trust, lack of faith, lack of belief, lack of national spirit, if you will. That, I think, Gordon, is our vulnerability. And triggering that and putting that together with the panic that ensues as a human instinct for self-preservation, that to me is the frightening combination. And that's what I'm most worried about when we talk about the possibilities for quote-unquote war. Different type of war, where the enemy is within, and they trigger the enemy within. Gordon, thank you very, very much, as usual. And special thank you for Lydia for putting it all together and making it work. Thank you, Gordon.
Well, thank you, Governor. And it's been an honor for me to talk to you. So I so much appreciate the time.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you, Gordon.